All right, today I'm going to talk about why I like to use small plugs to catch really big bass, and then when is the best time to actually utilize using something really big to catch big striped bass. So I for the most part, actually fish smaller lures. And the reason for that being, I find that people over exaggerate the amount of times that you fish big plugs and you're going to catch big striped bass. And I think that people put too much stock into that. And I think that that works great in cutting out a lot of the smaller fish that you'll catch. But at the same time, how many times have you thrown a massive lure and you've had a really small fish come up and hit it? There's a lot of times that happens. And I think that if you use a small plug like this, you would be surprised at how many very large fish will actually go out of their way to go eat it. And for whatever reason, I found that those smaller plugs, when you're throwing the smaller lures, now it might be in my area where it matches a lot of the bait that's in my area, but it also, I think, is a very non-threatening, easy meal for the striped bass. Instead of it having to really hunt down a big prey item, hit it multiple times, trying to injure it to get it into a position where it can eat the whole fish, which what striped bass do, because they have no teeth, they can't bite it in half or anything. They have to swallow the entire prey item. And I think that they have to really injure the bait fish to get that whole thing, and they grab it. And you can see a lot of the time when a big striped bass grabs a big piece of bait, they'll eat it, they'll spin it around in their mouth a bit, and then they'll actually swallow the fish. Now, when they're not being super aggressive and they're not maybe actively feeding, a small little bait fish that is this big, and for a bass that's 40 plus inches, this is really small. They can just inhale this up on the surface. So they see this walking across the surface of the water and they're like, man, I can just inhale that spook, no problem. It has a nice, subtle, injured bait look to it. It's not a huge bait fish, so it's not really something that they'll have to expend a ton of energy to eat, and it seems to them to be a very easy meal. Now, people always think, oh, you need a big profile when you're fishing big surf because the striped bass can't really see the fish or the lure up on the surface. They won't be able to actually see that and where it is and go after it. Now, that's also kind of an interesting thing because you'd be surprised if the striped bass really want something, they'll see it and they'll go after it. And it's because we don't sense things the same way that the striped bass do. I mean, they know what's going on all around them in the water. They can feel it through their lateral line, and the way that they're designed is to be able to sense everything in the water. And so they'll know even this tiny little bait fish up on the surface of the choppy water, this tiny little plug that's up on the surface of the choppy water, they're gonna know it's up there, and if they want it, they're gonna go get it. And a lot of the time you'll have these really big fish early in the morning and they're cruising around and they're looking for prey, but they're not really willing to hit something that's super big. And throwing this smaller plug is a perfect size range that mimics a ton of the bait that they eat, whether that be mackerel, herring, pogies, anything like that. It's small, it's like 6 inches, but this will definitely mimic that bait range. And those striped bass love all of those bait fish, and they'll go out of their way to hit it. And so for those reasons, and there's probably even more reasons for them wanting to hit smaller profile plugs, but I'm just rationalizing it in my human brain to their fish brain, like why this would be. But regardless, I mean, the times that I've seen people throwing small lures and catching bigger fish than the people that are throwing big lures right to their left or right is enough to make you think that those striped bass are wanting to seek out the smaller profile bait fish and to seek out the smaller profile lure that's on the surface of the water. So it is all very interesting, and I'm only speculating into why I think that they do it, but to me it just kind of makes sense that they are not really wanting to go out of their way to hit this. And it would be, or they don't want to go out of their way to hit a plug that's really big. They actually want to go and feed on something that is easy for them to eat and just keep moving and not have to really expend a ton of energy trying to kill, I guess, and like hunt down and kill. And it seems like that's a huge misconception. Like, people always throw really big stuff and they try to throw the biggest metal lips and the biggest spooks. And I don't think all the time that is necessarily the best thing to do. And I think a lot of the time having something smaller like this is less threatening for the striped bass. Now, there are times though where you want to throw a big profile lure like this. And a few of those times that I always think of is, number one, when you have bass feeding very aggressively. One of the best ways to pull bigger fish out of a school of bass that are feeding really aggressively is scale up your lure, and hopefully that it will cull a bigger fish to go after it. And that's because those fish are really aggressive. They want to eat a big meal, and they're trying to find the biggest meal to eat with the least amount of energy to expend. So during a blitz, that would be a great time to throw this. And the other great time to throw this would be if there is a lot of really big profile bait in your area. So I did just talk about pogies, and I did just talk about mackerel. But the thing about pogies and mackerel is they have a very big, they're not always very small bait fish. A lot of the time they're this mid-range size, but there are times where you have horse mackerel, you have giant 12-inch long pogies, just big bait fish in your area. And if you know that there are big bait fish in your area, then yeah, you're gonna match the hatch and want to match the hatch with a big profile lure like this. The other time that I've found that the striped bass are more willing to go after a big prey item is when you have a big low pressure system move through, whether that is a big thunderstorm in the summer, which you gotta be careful not to get struck by lightning, but seriously, like whether or not that's a big thunderstorm that's moving through and it's creating that low for a little bit, or if there's a nor'easter that blows through and that's, plummets the barometric pressure, and there's big surf and big waves and rain and all the rest, throwing a big profile lure, not only will that get the attention of the fish, but it will also, it gives them a big meal to go after, and they are feeding aggressively. Like those fish are feeling it. Like for whatever reason, striped bass just become 10 times more aggressive and 10 times more willing. And throwing a big profile like this just gets them really competitive and really wanting to go hit it. And so I've always found that during big low pressure systems, you can scale up your plugs. But in the same sense, when you have a high pressure system, there's not a lot of really big fish around, there's not a lot of competition. That's when you want to downscale and throw those smaller sized lures. And I would say for the most part, you have those lull periods, those times where the fish aren't feeding very aggressively. And that's when you want to reach for those smaller size spooks. The two spooks that I've been showing off here are the Pumbaa Plugs walkers. This is the walker and this is the Magnum walker. Both of these are kind of all-time plugs for me. Like I've caught monster fish on both of these. I've caught some of the biggest bass I've ever caught in my life on the Magnum walker, and I've caught multiple mid 40-inch range fish on the walker. And obviously, I said bigger fish on this, I know, but I'm saying on average, when you're fishing and the conditions are calm, even if and I talked about the choppiness and all that, and that, the whole reason I was trying to talk about the water being choppy and the fish being able to see even such a small profile up on the surface is just to try to explain, these fish really can feel that stuff that's up on the surface. But when it is a high pressure system, there's not a ton of chop and it's really calm out, throwing the small profile is more than enough to get their attention, because it can, even when there is choppy surface movement and surf and everything like that. But it will give you the ability to not only get the attention of the fish, but it makes it a very easy meal for the fish to go up and just inhale. And you have a lot of very secure hookups on big fish with smaller profile lures. And really the main reason I'm making this video, and I really want to get across this to a lot of people, is don't be afraid to throw small lures to catch big fish. I know there's the whole thing, elephants eat peanuts, but it's true. They do eat small profile bait. That's something that striped bass, I would say the majority of what they're feeding on is smaller profile things. Yes, a striped bass would rather have one big meal and then not have to hunt, but that's not always the reality of it. They're always rooting around for crabs. If there's shrimp, they're very opportunistic feeders. So seeing something like this that's a smaller profile, that's up on the surface, they're gonna wanna go and eat that. And I think that it all stems down to it just being very non-threatening to them. And I think that that's something that big striped bass, they'll follow in big plugs, but they'll actually, when it's a big high pressure system, how many times have you, I mean, I know that's happened a ton for me, and I'm sure a lot of you out there, this has also happened, where you're working in a big lure, whether that is a big metal lip swimmer or a big spook, and you have a big fish that's just following behind it and not committing to eat it. I can't tell you how many times I've downscaled my lure dramatically in those scenarios and then had that fish eat. Or when you have a lot of fish following, just downscaling in general is gonna have those fish eat. And it's all because they feel like they can get away with eating this with a lot less drama than they can with trying to eat a larger profile bait fish. And I hope that I've done a good job of explaining this, or at least in some way gotten you guys to understand what I'm trying to say, because it is super powerful to use smaller profile lures. And you know, like I fish a lot of like smaller pencils as well. Like there's times where you want to throw bigger plugs. Of course, there's times, and I talked about that. But a lot of the lures, as you can see, are, you know, 5-6 inch lures that I'm throwing. And that's just because I've always found that the really big bass, when they're being picky, which they are 90% of the time during the day, they're not like really going out of their way to eat stuff. I mean, you have to be in such perfect conditions to get those fish to actually go out of their way to hit something, that the times that that happens is so rare that for the most part, I'm throwing these smaller profile things because those fish don't really want to go out of their way and they want the easy meal. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.